Welcome to the Chapter 8, Part 1 lecture. You should use the information in this lecture to complete the Chapter 8, Part 1 guided notes, which of course you should complete before you attend class. Chapter 8 covers two important topics, energy and enzymes. In this part of the lecture, we'll define what energy is, discuss a little bit about how energy behaves with the laws of thermodynamics, and discuss how energy behaves in chemical reactions. We'll also identify some important chemical reactions that you'll need to know. The universe is essentially made of two components, matter and energy. Matter is the stuff of the universe. It has mass and takes up space. We discussed matter in Chapter 2 when we talked about atoms and elements. Energy is the kind of force that makes matter do things. It makes matter react, it makes matter move. Removing it makes matter stop moving or stop reacting. Another way to define energy is as the capacity to do work and transfer heat. Now, matter exists in many different forms. There's kinetic and potential, mechanical and chemical, and energy also includes things like heat, light, electrical energy, atomic energy, and so on. Here are the two most common categories of energy, kinetic and potential. Kinetic energy is energy in motion. Objects that are moving, such as these penguins flying off the iceberg, have kinetic energy. You also find kinetic energy in light reflecting off of an object, in heat rising from molecules, in electricity flowing through objects, even in the vibrations of atoms inside a solid. That represents kinetic energy. Potential energy is stored energy. So for instance, the energy that you find inside a battery is stored up. It has the potential to do work, so we call it potential energy. You also find potential energy in the bonds between atoms. So for instance, there's energy in the bond between this carbon and this hydrogen, holding them together. An object can also have potential energy because of its position relative to the Earth. So for instance, this little penguin that's on the edge of the iceberg, it isn't falling forward yet, it's not flying through the air yet, but gravity is going to be pulling pretty hard on its body and pulling it down, so it has the most potential energy. It has the most potential to fly forward. This penguin back here at the back of the line is pretty stable. Gravity is going to be pulling on this penguin a little bit less, so it has less potential energy. Another way to classify energy is as chemical energy or mechanical energy. Now, chemical energy, as the name implies, is the energy inside chemicals. It's the energy that helps hold the bonds between atoms together. It's the energy within the atoms that allows the electrons to move around in the electron clouds. For instance, inside our muscle cells, you'll find sugars, and sugars contain the energy that will allow our muscle cells to contract. That's chemical energy. When two or more parts of a system physically fit together and physically move together, we say that they have mechanical energy. So for instance, when the gears inside this bicycle are moving around and around, we say they have mechanical energy. Another example of mechanical energy occurs in the muscles of your arm. When you contract the muscles of your arm, the muscles pull on the bones and move the arm relative to the joints and make them bend. We say that those large moving parts working together have mechanical energy. I'd like you to take a moment and practice working with these terms before we move on. For this Yearturn, you should examine each scenario and determine which type of energy you think it represents. Now, for the purpose of this Yearturn, let's limit it to kinetic and potential energy only. The truth is that if you look at these scenarios too closely, you'll find every kind of energy represented in every situation. So let's just keep it simple. So what did you come up with? Let's take a look at each one. First, a stationary roller coaster on top of a drop. That is going to be potential energy. Gravity is pulling on that roller coaster and will allow it to start moving, but it's not quite moving yet. Number two, blood flow in an artery. The word flow implies motion, which of course would be kinetic energy. Number three, an unopened can of carbonated soda. That, of course, is going to be potential energy. If you've ever shaken a can up, you've added energy to the system, which is why it explodes when you open it. Number four, energy in chemical bonds of glucose in cells. That's going to be stored energy. That's potential energy. Number five, leg muscles when you are standing on a ladder. That's a little more complicated. In a sense, since you are standing still, that represents potential energy. But if you know anything about muscles, you know that muscles have muscle tone, which means some are always contracting or you wouldn't be standing up straight. So the contracting muscles might represent a little kinetic energy as well. Finally, number six, climbing the ladder. Climbing implies motion, which is going to be kinetic. The laws of thermodynamics help describe a little bit about how energy behaves. The first law of thermodynamics is known as the law of conservation of energy, and it tells us that energy is never created nor destroyed. For instance, when you eat a big sandwich, there's energy inside that sandwich, but you're not creating that energy. It's just being transferred into your cells. When you set something on fire, that thing will burn up and the energy will largely be released as heat and light, that's the fire, but some of that energy will remain inside the molecules that are left over. So energy isn't created and energy isn't destroyed, but it can change from one form to another. This law tells us that, in other words, the total amount of energy in a closed system is going to remain constant unless something either adds energy to the system or takes energy away from the system. But the energy will never be created or destroyed. Here we have a great example of energy changing forms. Now, I love to ride my bike, and here in Austin I can tell you that riding your bike means you're either going up a hill or down a hill. There's very few flat spots. Let's talk about what happens energetically while that's going on. Now, when I'm riding up a hill like this, I am not creating energy. But what's happening is that some of my kinetic energy, the energy of my motion, is getting transferred and changed into potential energy. When I'm finally at the top of the hill, I have the most potential energy. And as I start to cruise down the hill, that energy will change forms again from potential back into kinetic. And that means that my body can move faster, the bike can move faster, the gears can move faster, and we can move faster as we charge down the hill. So I'm not creating or destroying energy, but it is changing from one form to another, and it can change back and forth. Another great example of energy changing forms can be seen in food chains or food webs. It all starts with the sun. Now, the sun isn't creating energy, but it is releasing a lot of energy through fusion reactions. So that solar energy comes down and it hits this plant. The plant is able to convert that solar energy into chemical energy, which it uses to power its cells. When the mouse eats the plant, some of that energy is going to be converted into chemical energy inside the mouse, and some of it will be lost as heat. When the hawk eats the mouse, the same thing happens again. Some of that chemical energy goes into running the hawk, and some of it is lost as heat. So in this way, energy changes forms from one form to the next as it flows through this ecosystem, but it's not created and it's not destroyed. The energy that goes back into the atmosphere as heat is still present. It's just not chemical energy anymore. It's heat energy, which incidentally is considered one of the lowest forms and least useful forms of energy. The second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy. The law of entropy describes a couple of different phenomena that have to do with energy. First, it tells us that the amount of useful energy in a system tends to decrease as energy changes from one form to another. Second, it describes kind of how molecules within that system are going to behave. The term entropy refers to the tendency of molecules to go from an organized state to a less organized state. So in other words, it says that large molecules tend to break down over time, going from organized molecules to less organized molecules. Let's apply the law of entropy in this example. Here we have gasoline molecules. Gasoline molecules are pretty organized and they have a lot of chemical energy. Now, if you take those gasoline molecules and you put them in a combustion engine, they'll burn, and that energy will be converted into mechanical energy that runs the car, and also a lot of it will be converted into heat energy that's lost through the exhaust. Now, the molecules in the gasoline are also changing. They start out as these complex gas molecules, and they end up as these smaller, less complex molecules that we find in the exhaust. Now, the heat energy that is released by this reaction is less useful than the chemical energy we started with in the gasoline. We could do some work using that heat energy, but not nearly as much as is needed to run a combustion engine, as we find in the gasoline. So as the molecules within a closed system break down, entropy increases and the amount of useful energy that's available decreases. This is a problem for living things. In order to remain alive, living things have to build molecules and maintain their large molecules and maintain homeostasis. So how can they do this with the law of entropy going on? Well, living things tend to buck entropy, they tend to resist entropy, but in order to do that and build big molecules, they have to have a constant input of energy from the environment. So that's the reason that we eat. We eat to take in nutrients and building blocks for our molecules, but also the energy that we need to build those molecules and keep them from falling apart. Think about what happens to a body when something dies. Entropy sort of takes over, and the molecules gradually break down from really complicated to less complicated forms. Here's a nice tricky year turn. I want you to really think about these laws of thermodynamics, and I want you to tell me why you think your body temperature increases when you exercise. I also want you to tell me how this relates to both laws of thermodynamics. Brainstorm it, jot down an answer, and bring it to class with you. Now, chemicals, of course, contain chemical energy. So in this next section, we are going to discuss how energy tends to change and how it tends to flow from reactants towards products within a chemical reaction. It's going to be very important for you to understand and remember the relationship between building molecules and breaking molecules and energetically what's happening. In general, whenever we take a big molecule like glucose and break it down into smaller molecules like CO2 and water, energy is going to be released. Breaking atomic bonds releases energy. Now we can do the opposite as well. If we take these little molecules and build them into glucose, that's going to capture energy. So in that case, we would have to add some energy to that system to get that to happen. Now, why do we have to do that? Well, it's because these little molecules have to work against entropy to be built into a larger molecule. So breaking molecules releases energy, building molecules tends to capture energy. Different chemical reactions used by cells are going to either release or absorb different amounts of energy depending on the type of reaction that we're dealing with. Here's an example. You can take glucose and you can actually set glucose on fire. Sugar will burn, believe it or not. We'd call that a combustion reaction. Now, if we set glucose on fire, it's going to release a lot of energy all at once. That's the heat and the light of the flame that you see. That's not super useful for living cells. For one thing, cells would set themselves on fire if they started trying to combust their glucose. Also, because all the energy is released at once, it makes it hard to capture and hard to deal with. So living cells tend to have a different approach. When they release energy, for instance, they will do it in a series of steps. So they might break glucose down a little bit, get some energy out, break it down a little bit more, get some more energy out. They get all these little bits of energy out of glucose one step at a time through a series of smaller reactions, and that allows them to capture a larger amount overall. All chemical reactions require an input of energy to get started. We refer to this as the activation energy, or the energy of activation, or the E with a little subscript A, E to the A. Lighting a match is a great example of activation energy. There are two or more chemicals that sit on the head of any typical match, and those chemicals can sit on the head of the match and not react with each other pretty much indefinitely. It's not until you strike the match that the chemicals react and start a combustion reaction. So why is that? Well, when you strike a match, that friction is adding energy to the system, and that energy allows the molecules to start moving faster so that they will actually react with one another. So striking the match is adding activation energy to the system, and the reaction takes off. So why do chemical reactions need activation energy? Well, think of it this way. If we have these little molecules and we want them to react with one another, they're going to have to physically hit together. And they're going to have to smack together with enough physical force to actually react, to overcome their natural repulsion of one another. So by adding energy to the system, we say that we bring these molecules into the transition state. The transition state is actually a fairly unstable state, but at this point, the molecules have the maximum potential energy. They have the most potential to react with one another. If they're moving with sufficient speed, they can hit together in the right orientation and react and produce the products. Next, we'll discuss different types of chemical reactions that we'll see in action inside living cells. Now, there are many different categories of chemical reactions out there. For our purposes, we're going to think of reactions as fitting into two categories: building reactions that capture energy and breaking reactions that release energy. This first category includes reactions that break molecules and release energy. Molecules that release energy are called exergonic. Think of the energy exiting the system. Reactions that break molecules, rather, are called catabolic reactions. To remember that term, I think about my cat knocking stuff off of my shelves and breaking it, because cats are kind of jerks and they like to do that. So a catabolic reaction breaks molecules. Here we have the example that we were looking at before, where we take glucose and we break it down into carbon dioxide and water. We take a big molecule and break it into small molecules. When that happens, energy is going to be released, and we consider that an exergonic reaction. This line graph represents the progression of an exergonic reaction. So here again, we're going to start with glucose. Now, glucose has a certain amount of energy, so it's sort of high on this y-axis. Notice that as the reaction begins, there's a bump. This bump is the energy of activation. That's the energy that has to be added to the system to get this reaction going. Once the energy of activation has been accomplished, the reaction can proceed, and notice that the products of this reaction have less energy than the reactants that we started with. So energy was released through this system, making the reaction exergonic. Now, endergonic or anabolic reactions build molecules and capture energy. The endergonic part refers to the capture of energy, so imagine energy going into the system and being captured. And anabolic refers to the building of molecules. Here's an example. If we take CO2 and water and we add enough energy to it, we can build it into a molecule of glucose. One molecule of glucose is quite a bit bigger than these little molecules of CO2 and water that we started with. So the energy that's been added to the system has been captured inside this glucose molecule. That's an endergonic reaction. Living cells will often put exergonic and endergonic reactions together to make the products that they need. Let's say, for instance, that we actually want to make this little product. We're calling it H. In order to make H, we have to perform this reaction, and that requires energy. Now, where can we get this energy? Well, maybe we can use this reaction to power it. This reaction is exergonic because it releases energy, and then that energy can be used to power the bottom reaction, which is endergonic. When this occurs, we refer to this as a coupled reaction, and cells use coupled reactions all the time. They use exergonic reactions to release energy that can then be used to build something that they want to make. This simple diagram contains an example of a coupled reaction. So for this Yearturn, I would like you to examine this diagram and tell me where you think the endergonic part is and where you think the exergonic part is. Notice that one reaction is powering the other reaction. So catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions work together all the time inside living cells. Again, the catabolic reactions release energy by breaking molecules, and then that energy can be used to power anabolic reactions. So in other words, by breaking down something like a carbohydrate, like glucose, into CO2 and water, that can provide the energy to build amino acids into something big like a protein. The energy released by catabolic reactions can't jump directly into the anabolic reactions. They need something to physically transfer that energy from one set of molecules into another set of molecules. So there are actually a couple of extra steps that happen inside living cells. When these big molecules are broken down and that energy is released, they will often be used to build some smaller molecules, things like ATP and some of our molecules known as energy carriers like NADH and FADH2. Those small molecules will then be transferred into the anabolic reactions. They'll be broken down, which is another tiny catabolic reaction, and then that energy will be released into the reaction that can build something big, something like a protein, for instance. Now, once that happens, those little energy carriers are going to be depleted. So they're going to need to travel back to the catabolic reactions so they can pick up some more energy and be built again, which is another little anabolic reaction. They can then dump their energy out into the anabolic reactions again to build big things. They get depleted, and so on. So we have this cycling of energy between large molecules and small molecules that keeps everything running. Next, let's look at a few specific examples of catabolic and anabolic reactions. First, we have a set that we've talked about before, oxidation and reduction. Oxidation and reduction reactions produce ions. So they have to do with the transfer of electrons from one molecule to another. In an oxidation reaction, a molecule is going to lose an electron. So this little green compound, whatever it is, has lost an electron and it's gained a positive charge because of that. So we say it has become oxidized. Now, once it loses one or more electrons, it's going to have that positive charge, so we would call it a cation. Reduction is the opposite. In a reduction reaction, a compound is going to gain an electron. So this little orange blob over here is taking in that electron, or sometimes more than one electron. So we say it has become reduced. Because it's been reduced, it's going to have a negative charge, and we would call it an anion. Now I know the word reduction seems kind of backwards. It's reduced, which makes you think it's getting smaller, but it's actually gaining an electron. So you just have to remember that it's one of those opposite words in biology. It's a poorly named term, especially for freshman students. What's actually being reduced when this molecule takes in that electron is the amount of potential energy that it has. So that's why it's called a reduction. Here's a memory trick that you can use for oxidation and reduction. I'm from North Texas, and there's a lot of oil production, a lot of oil rigs going on up there. So when I think of oxidation, I think of the word oil, which stands for oxidation is losing. And then I think about rig for reduction. And rig stands for reduction is gaining. What's being lost and gained? Well, electrons, of course. But remember, oil rig. Oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. Oxidation and reduction reactions go together. When one thing loses an electron, something else is going to take it up. The cell doesn't typically just release electrons into the environment because they can cause a lot of havoc. When oxidations and reductions go together, we refer to that collectively as a redox reaction. And here's an example. When we put sodium and chlorine atoms together, sodium is going to give its electron to chlorine. Sodium, in this example, goes through an oxidation. It is oxidized. And chlorine goes through a reduction. It is reduced. Sodium gets a positive charge because it's lost an electron, and chlorine gets a negative charge because it's gained an electron. Now, this particular redox reaction is pretty easy to interpret because there's a complete transfer of electrons from one atom to another, and that's represented with these little symbols. Other redox reactions can be a little trickier to recognize because sometimes in these reactions, the electrons will just be shifted around a little bit, and it changes the potential energy within the atom and within the molecule. It's important to remember that reactions like oxidations and reductions represent a transfer of energy from one molecule to another. For instance, in an oxidation, an electron is going to be lost. That electron carries energy with it. So when that electron is transferred from one molecule to another, it carries a little bit of energy away from the original molecule, and it adds it to the second molecule. Now, electrons can have different amounts of energy depending on what's going on with them. If the molecules are exposed to heat or light, their electrons tend to have more energy than if they are cold and sluggish. This Yearturn represents a reaction that we're going to look at in more detail in Chapter 9, and it is purposely tricky. In order to answer these questions, you really have to think about what you know about oxidations and reductions, and you need to look at the diagram and interpret what you see. See what answers you could come up with, and bring them to class with you, and we'll discuss it. Another set of reactions you're going to see in action quite a bit in later chapters are phosphorylations and dephosphorylations. What fantastic long words. To put it simply, a phosphorylation occurs when a phosphate group is added to something. So if we have this blobby protein here, and we add to it a phosphate group, we say it has been phosphorylated. By adding this big old phosphate group to that molecule has gained some energy. So phosphorylation represents an endergonic, anabolic reaction. The opposite of that is known as dephosphorylation. This is where you take a molecule that has a phosphate group and you remove it. You take the phosphate off. Dephosphorylations release energy. So at the end of the reaction, the product has less energy than the reactant that you started with because that phosphate group carries energy. This is considered an exergonic or catabolic reaction. All right, good for you. You've made it to the end of Chapter 8, Part 1. Hopefully you don't harbor too many negative feelings about energy and how it works. Make sure you fill in the guided notes very thoroughly and give all those Yearturns a try. Bring them to class with you, and we're going to work with them. We'll see you in class next time.